Hello and welcome to today's webinar to all of our wonderful viewers, and I see quite a few people coming in and joining us, so welcome. My name is George, and joining me today is Dave, and today we are going to be talking about streaming protocols. Super exciting topic, even though it on the surface maybe doesn't sound like it. It actually is really interesting and very exciting these days in the world of live streaming. So sit back and relax, and we're going to dive into it in a moment. For those of you who have joined us on previous webinars, there is a Q&A panel in Crowdcast where you can put your questions. There's also an upvote tool as part of that, so if you see someone else's question that you would like answered in some sort of priority, use that upvote, and I will be monitoring those and looking at those. We'll probably hold most of that Q&A until the end, unless something really relevant to where we're at in the presentation pops up. But of course there's also chat, so feel free to say hi in chat. Less pressing questions that maybe our moderators can answer for you, feel free to put those in chat. But if it's something for myself or for Dave, try to use the Q&A panel so that we can see it and people can do the upvote. Otherwise it may get lost in the chat, in the running chat. So I do still see some people trickling in here, so we'll give it another minute or so before we really get started. Just want to make sure that everyone is here. All right, let's see. We also will have a number of polls coming up throughout the webinar. The first one is up now. It's just asking a very simple question of what sector are you part of? What sort of business are you in? You're a live event guy, education, that kind of thing. So weigh in on that. This is actually very helpful for us in the context of today's subject because we're learning and developing and finding out all kinds of information in terms of how different industries are using live streaming. And especially with the new protocols that we're going to be talking about today, that could be super important. So weigh in on that poll, and we'll have a bunch more coming up. Again, answer those in the poll section and not just in chat so that we can actually tally those votes. And of course, as Alberto just said in chat, feel free to say hi. Feel free to say where you're from. It's always interesting to see a huge mix of people from all over the world on these webinars. It's great. All right, I think we will get started pretty quickly here. Number of people joining has kind of leveled out a little bit, so I think we're probably good to get started very soon here. Yeah. Let's do it, Dave. Let's jump in, and people will catch up if they missed the beginning part.
So, yeah, we're talking all about HLS, MPEG-DASH, and SRT today. So, for those of you who have been watching kind of our various social channels and other things, you'll know we recently added these protocols to Pearl. But today we're going to dive into a little bit more of the details and help you understand a little bit more about why these three things exist, what they are, how they're different, how to use them, that kind of thing. So hopefully some good practical advice. And as George mentioned, if you got questions, pop them in the Q&A, and we'd love to stick around afterwards, even if it runs a little long, and answer whatever questions you have about any of these things. So
absolutely.
Maybe we'll get started with the slides here.
Yeah.
So first up,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, first up, we're going to talk about the new era of video streaming. And, that's not just COVID related. We're talking just about the way things have progressed from the time where kind of internet streaming or video streaming over the internet started many years ago to where we are today. We'll get into HLS and DASH and SRT and talk a little bit about what they are. And then we're going to show you how to configure SRT for best results. So one of the things SRT gives you is ability to tune it a little bit to the network connection that you have and the application that you're trying to fit into. And then we'll briefly talk about the support for these protocols on Pearl. We've kind of covered that in some other webinars and live shows, but we'll do a quick dive there. And then, of course, your questions. So we'll get to those near the end.
Yeah. So I think the interesting one to kind of start from is that first piece, the new era of video streaming, providing some historical context to all of this, where we were and where we're going.
Yep.
That's really the interesting one to start with. And again, people are probably very familiar with how things work currently, but they may not be familiar with some of these new protocols.
Yeah, and HLS, I mean, a lot of people hear about HLS, especially because, I mean, it was developed by Apple. It's very popular. But most of what people are familiar with, or most of the context in which they hear that, is more on the distribution side of kind of consuming the video. And really what we're focused on here at Epiphan Video, and certainly today in this webinar, is the ingest side. How do you contribute that content so that it can then be distributed? So we're really focused on that side. So HLS, very, very popular on the distribution side, and now kind of making its way onto the contribution side. It's been there for a while, but it's still not the dominant protocol. We still have RTMP as kind of the gorilla there, but these are the ones that are, Dash and HLS are really the ones that are trying to take over that. And then of course SRT's come along, and it's got its own kind of charms. It comes from a different problem it's trying to solve, and does it in a different way. So we'll walk through those a little bit. George, maybe walk us through some of the history of where we're coming from and how we got here.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, in our own personal lives, if we think about things maybe 20 years ago, it doesn't sometimes feel that long ago. But in terms of, the internet, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, is a night and day difference to where we are now. And especially in live streaming. So way back, about 20 years ago, Macromedia developed RTMP, real-time messaging protocol, which is something that the vast majority of streaming things are still using today. Of course, in 2005, they were acquired by Adobe, and Adobe kind of started rolling that out to a broader audience as basically a free protocol for people to use, where Macromedia was trying to license it and bundle it with their services. And that served for a long time. With the launch of iOS, in kind of 2007 and moving forward, Apple found that what they wanted on their devices wasn't quite cutting it, and they wanted something different, and that was going to just run better on their hardware, as Apple does. That's what they're so good at. And so in 2009, they launched HLS, HTTP live streaming, to really provide a better consumer experience on primarily iOS-based devices, but it really branched out from there very quickly into browsers and everything else. Of course, not to be outdone by that, ISO decided that they wanted to kind of tackle the same issue, solve the same problems with something that's a little more open source, and they went with what we call DASH, Dynamic Adaptive Streaming over HTTP. We'll definitely go with DASH because that name is way too long to say. And again, trying to solve adaptive bit rates, the consuming side, but both of these have publishing side, contribution sides as well. But they weren't heavily used back then, and we're starting to see that change now. And then in 2017, Haivision decided that they were trying to solve a different problem. Haivision has a big focus on more of this traditional broadcast style of infrastructure. And, they were running into lots of other problems where, trying to reduce the cost of site-to-site transport and low latency across the internet and all these different things. And the existing protocols just weren't doing it. And so they ended up with SRT, also an open source protocol, which also means you can do basically anything you want with it if you so desire. And it's made up of members of the SRT Alliance in a big way, which Epiphan is a member of. And they kind of all use and contribute and interop with each other in a lot of ways, which is really interesting. So yeah, maybe we'll break these down a little more individually and look at the differences between them, and of course that'll lead into how we might apply them in different use cases.
Yeah, so HLS and MPEG-DASH, when we look at what needs they fill, as George mentioned, it's both on the distribution side as well as on the contribution side. So some of the main reasons that they exist and why they were developed, the adaptive streaming and that kind of thing, is more on the distribution side. But it it really is kind of the next generation protocol after RTMP. We've seen on the previous slide just how long ago Macromedia first created that. They had no idea what was coming in terms of, today's internet. So it's there to replace it, and not just to replace it, but to replace it with something that is a foundation to build upon again, right? So you can build upon a foundation until you get so many stories on the building that it's time to knock it down and build a bigger or better foundation. And that's really what the HLS and MPEG-DASH were meant to do, was kind of start over and create something that we can build on going forward. And it's easier and cheaper for the CDNs to deploy. So that's obviously a big one as we try to scale the amount of streaming that's happening, especially live streaming. That scalability is very important, and the CDNs, they need to be able to do that in an economical way, and these protocols really help them to do that. And of course, we needed something that plays well with firewalls and proxies, because it's not just big broadcast that is trying to do this streaming. This streaming's happening from everywhere. It's happening from behind firewalls in private businesses, private homes, big business, sports venues, all over the place. And so it needed to be firewall friendly as well. And they are. So these protocols do really well to sort of take what RTMP did well and then build upon that so that we can get to more comprehensive features and kind of a new way of doing things going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to mention that some larger CDNs have already started to end support for RTMP. So this isn't necessarily a far future problem where we need to get away from RTMP. This is something that is a 2020 issue among all the other 2020 issues, looking at all these things. And so, it's important to look at, the future of which of these protocols is going to serve you. And that's part of our goal today, of course, is to see, try to provide some background so that later on, maybe you can make the choice that's going to suit you best. I think one of the big things of why they're getting away from it is just due to its age and the fact that, like many things in the computing world, when certain things are created and invented, they kind of say, well, this will serve for now, and they don't always think about what it's going to be like in 20 years. I mean, we still don't know in 20 years what the internet will look like. So RTMP is very limited in that respect. It doesn't do a lot of extras. It basically just transports a limited amount of data from a video and audio track perspective, limited in the codecs that it can encapsulate. So it doesn't serve everything. And with HLS and Dash, one of the big objectives was, okay, we know that in the next foreseeable future, we're going to need these extras, and building in support for that was a big deal. So I think one of the big ones we've seen, and again, just in the context of today,
we have, and that's exactly what I'm using today. So I've got a Canon M200 just with the kit lens. So a nice little camera, very simple. And I'm just running that straight into a Pearl Mini actually, and then SRT into the office. So we can kind of cover all those details later, but
I think we're back.
Yep.
So, all right, where were we? So the other thing I was saying right as Dave was dropping off is sometimes when I talk about things like multilingual support, I, in my own mind, also include things like closed captioning as part of that, because it really is making things accessible in my mind when I say something like multilingual. It's all about accessibility. And that's another thing that HLS and Dash have that RTMP can't really encapsulate is, things like closed captioning or maybe embedded advertising, and just there's a lot more space for kind of extra metadata and all kinds of other little tools, which can really help improve and open up the content. The other one, although primarily on the consumption side, as we've talked about, is DRM as well. And again, obviously from Apple's perspective, that was a big one from the consumption side, is having some option for DRM built in there as well. From a contribution side, that's not really a big deal, but it might be in the future. We might start seeing, more of these things. I mean, I don't know how many people in watching today, keep an eye on live streaming news, especially in the Twitch community. But, dealing with DRM and stuff like that in terms of people getting copyright strikes and things like that has become a big thing in live streaming. And so I think in the future, protocols that are going to have some level of DRM, as right now one of the big barriers is, even if you have the license to maybe reuse music, live streaming doesn't know that and can't know that. So you might still end up in a negative copyright position if you use someone else's music. And in the future, with protocols like this having the ability built in, we might see ways of embedding all of that data with licensing and stuff to avoid these things. And so again, future codecs are going to give us a lot more potential with these things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a big one. I mean, a lot of people have been caught on that where they've got the proper licensing, but just the mechanism of making sure all that works during the live stream is anything but smooth at the moment. And that's
it just
really,
doesn't.
There's lots of those little things that these newer protocols are going to bring about. It'll take time for all that to get developed, but we've got new kind of protocols with the infrastructure underneath that can handle all that. So it's great to be able to kind of jump into that. Let's talk about SRT a little bit and how it's a little different than Dash and HLS in the problem that it's trying to solve and the way that it solved it. I think often when I hear people referring to SRT, it's often about the fact that it's secure. Obviously, that's part of the title, secure and reliable, but also low latency. So latency for many applications is an important thing that people want to be able to control and have some kind of at least visibility, if not some control over. And that's something that most other protocols don't provide. And of course, like the other protocols, it's got to be firewall friendly. So I think, going forward, everything's got to be firewall friendly. As we mentioned, streaming is happening from everywhere now, and you've got to find a way to easily connect these contribution sources to your backend and vice versa. So that's not, an IT nightmare every time you go to do it. If you can imagine going into, say, a hotel conference and using their IT infrastructure to get out of the building, trying to find their IT guy to open ports and do all this kind of stuff. It's a
or
hassle.
If they'll do it, even if you can't find them.
Exactly. So you really want the protocols, to play well with firewalls and give you some options on how to deal with those. And SRT really has that from the ground up. That's part of the problem they were trying to solve. So High Vision really looked at it from a broadcast contribution point of view. So this protocol is not one you're going to see on the distribution side. This is a pure kind of ingest protocol. You can send to an endpoint and they can view it, but the primary purpose is not to distribute it to mass viewers. The primary purpose is to be able to collect contribution feeds, control those latencies, do the production. And yes, you could serve it out to viewers over SRT, but that's really not its forte. Its forte is more on the other side.
Yeah. And as we mentioned earlier, it can be very customizable, which is a big difference between something like RTMP or even HLS or Dash, is that, aside from your codec settings, there's really nothing else you can do with those. Where with SRT, there's a ton more stuff, and we'll get into that a bit more. But the high quality is a big one. Unpredictable networks to a point. A total outage like Dave just suffered that's just, there's nothing you can do about that. But even if you have, I'm sure most people who have experimented with live streaming know that bandwidth is always a wave, right? There's no flat line, right? If you run a speed test 10 times throughout the day, you're going to get 10 different results, right? That's how bandwidth is. It's always doing this, peaks and valleys. And if you're really running at the limits, that can cause a lot of problems if the protocol doesn't adapt well. And that's one of the things that SRT can help with in terms of its reliability standpoint. And one of the other things is that, and how it does that is, instead of just feeding the video and audio, straight from your encoder, and in this graphic we're talking about using a Pearl Mini, but straight from your encoder through the internet to your CDN, there's also another piece of data coming back for diagnostic and packet recovery. And that's something that the other protocols don't, especially RTMP, just don't have. And that adds to the reliability of it. There's a little more two-way communication going on instead of just one way, throw it over the fence and hope it works. And that can make a big difference, especially at the enterprise level.
HLS and Dash kind of both have, I will call it, packet recovery mechanisms, but because they're based on HTTP, they're just reusing what was basically put in for file transfer kind of things. And really, if you look under the hood at HLS, it is essentially a file transfer. Your video is broken into small files and sent one at a time and received at the other end. So it's very much using a file transfer infrastructure. And the approach with SRT was to say, maybe for live video, the TCP layer that we're used to having in that stack is maybe not the best choice for live video and retransmission. HLS certainly works well and gives a great playback experience, but the cost there is latency. We'll see the same thing with SRT. You're trading latency to compensate for packet loss in the network, but what SRT gives you is a lot of control over how much you want to trade there. And HLS really doesn't. So HLS is a little simpler that way in terms of the user experience. SRT allows you to really get in there and kind of trade that off. So the dash line in this kind of diagram is meant to represent the fact that SRT as a transport protocol on its own is doing that packet recovery. It's not relying on the traditional kind of ISO stack of TCP and other protocols to do that retransmission. That's part of the SRT protocol itself. Sorry, I went backwards there. We've seen a huge increase in the interest in SRT, both from our customers asking us about, when is it going to be available on Pearl and should I be using it and all these kind of things. So we've had lots of those kind of discussions. But clearly the SRT Alliance, which as you mentioned, George, was started a couple of years back, has really gained so many more members in the last little while. Now we're talking hundreds of members, literally. This slide just shows, some of the bigger members in the group, but certainly there are hundreds of members, lots of products, and the products really have a broad range, all the way from the CDNs who are doing the distribution and that side of things, to hardware encoders, software encoders, PTZ cameras, you name it. There's a whole raft of products that are now supporting SRT. And I would say a year ago, certainly a year and a half ago, this list was much smaller. So there's a ton of momentum right now. The growth of the number of products and companies that are kind of jumping on board, including Epiphan, to support this protocol has really grown. And that's what we're so excited about. It has the momentum now to become very popular and ubiquitous. So it's not going to be this niche-y thing where you're trying to search for the specific encoder or camera that might support SRT. Chances are many of them will. And so that's a great change that we've seen over the last little while.
Yeah, exactly. And one person actually asked in chat, are any of the big CDNs accepting SRT for cloud transcoding? And, I bring that up now just because we had the Alliance slide up there. You saw quite a few CDNs listed there. Not all of them are using it yet, but they're definitely working on it. Right up at the top, you'll notice Wowza was listed there. They do. You can use SRT with Wowza. And actually, I believe it's not next week, the week after, some point in the future, actually, on our Thursday live show that we do every week, we're going to have a guest from Wowza, and we're probably going to press him on some of these questions. But they're an example of a fairly large CDN that does offer cloud-based services, as well as on-premise services, and they've been a member of the SRT Alliance for quite some time, and have been doing that. So, and we've been, working with Wowza for a long time ourselves, and we're really excited to see where that goes with people using Pearls and SRT and Wowza together, in terms of how that's going to get leveraged. So, and there will definitely be others down the road as well.
Yeah. that list will definitely grow as more and more people adopt it. And it really, to a certain extent, that's what we were waiting for, right? We needed to see that group grow enough and for there to be enough of the CDNs and other things that people need to connect to make sense to add it to our product. And we're there. Clearly we're there, and we're going to see, the SRT hub, which is kind of a virtual SDI cross connect in the cloud that's operated by Haivision. That's all implemented on Microsoft Azure. So there's big support there if you're delivering or creating services or video applications on Azure. You're going to be able to ingest SRT and outbound SRT from that. So it really is starting to kind of be supported in all of the base infrastructure, and then you'll see people build on top of that, and that's kind of where we're headed. One of the applications we're really excited about for our customer base is the ability to bring in that contribution feed or a remote guest into a production. We get a lot of questions of people saying, how do I do that? And SRT is really a great solution for that, better than anything else we've seen in the past. We've seen people do it with video conferencing software. We've done that ourselves. You could do it with RTSP or even RTMP and those kind of things, but really SRT does such a good job. That's what it was targeted for, and it's ideal for this kind of application.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the downsides of doing it with some of those older protocols was latency, and one of the downsides of doing it with video conferencing is quality. And so really neither one of these is ideal, and SRT can kind of solve both of those in ideal circumstances. So one of the things that you can do, and we might break this down in a little more detail, but this is actually what we're doing at the moment, where both Dave and I have Pearls in our homes. We're sending SRT streams from those Pearls to a Pearl that's sitting in our office, where it has a lot more bandwidth and a bunch of other tools and things like that we can leverage. And basically that Pearl is ingesting those SRT streams, sending it back out. And someone actually asked earlier whether or not we were publishing to Crowdcast using RTMP or with WebRTC. We're using RTMP. Because Crowdcast, which there's a reason why we use Crowdcast as a webinar platform, and that's mostly a tool thing. And they can take in RTMP. Hopefully someday they can do SRT, and then this will be even better. But right now, it means that we can send my SRT stream, Dave's SRT stream, amalgamate those together at a Pearl, send it out to Crowdcast over RTMP, and our producer is able to control everything remotely. And that's a big thing. And that's one of the things. I mean, I don't know about you, Dave, but I'm having that conversation on an almost daily basis with customers, trying to solve exactly that.
Yeah, we've had a lot of questions, and we've done, ever since this sort of shutdown and lockdown period started a few months back, we've been doing webinars at least once a week, if not twice a week. And regardless of the topic of the webinar, we're always asked, how are you guys actually producing your webinar? How are you managing to get your images from, George, you at home, me at home, and out to Crowdcast through obviously something that's doing production, that's adding titling and switching and all of that. So we're happy to share all those details, but really, that diagram says it all. George and I both have Pearl devices at our home, and we plug our cameras into that, and we go straight up into the Pearl 2 that's sitting in our Ottawa office. And as George mentioned, then our producer is operating the Pearl 2 there and inserting the titles you see and doing the switching. So this is literally our setup, and we can get into more detail later if people have questions, but this is really one of the applications that we're most excited about for SRT, because it does such a great job preserving the quality, giving you the ability to really deal with the unpredictability of the network and trade latency for quality, so you can really set up your production the way you want it to look.
Absolutely.
I would say the more kind of generic form of that is replacing that Pearl 2 with just about anything that's broadcast oriented. And this is really what Haivision had in mind when they started, right? Is bringing that feed in. So this is a very similar kind of diagram, just showing that that broadcast point can be a full-blown traditional production, and that's really where Haivision was going with it. So, where they used to have a satellite truck bringing the remote feeds in, and then you'd go to the main studio, and the main studio would do everything from the switching and branding and commercial insertion, all of that. You can still feed into that same production kind of infrastructure, but just replacing kind of the last mile stuff. Instead of the satellite truck going out, you're going out with a very small, hardware encoder, software encoder, whatever it is you need, and then bringing it back to that same production facility. So it really kind of evolves the production last mile to get away from the very expensive dedicated satellite links and this kind of stuff, and be able to go over a little less predictable public internet, but still be able to keep that quality very high. And so that's what SRT was built to do, and it does it very well.
Yeah, exactly. So we did put up a poll asking if anyone has used SRT yet. We do have a couple of polls up there, so please weigh in on those. One of them is asking whether or not you've ever used HLS or DASH up until this point, or whether or not you've ever used SRT. And we put one up just a moment ago asking, how often do you bring in remote guests? Whether that, answer that from maybe a more historical position or a right now position. And I think if we did it from a right now, it's probably pretty high. Everyone's trying to do that in these lockdown and social distancing conditions. But feel free to weigh in on those polls. So one of the things we also wanted to look at is trying to pick apart which protocol should you be considering or using in terms of your production needs.
Yep. And that really depends on a few things. Your application for one. So what is it you're trying to do? What are the latency requirements of that application? Because some things can be very latency sensitive, and other things not so much. So we mentioned in the past, HLS doesn't allow you to tailor the latency so much, and the latency tends to be quite high. So you're looking at, typically it's 10-second chunks that are built into those files, and it's multiple chunks, usually about 3 to 4 is your latency that you see as you're using HLS. And in many cases, that's just perfectly fine. You're doing a broadcast and all your viewers are seeing it 40 seconds later, but that's not an issue. Other applications, that might be an issue if you're expecting real kind of live response from your audience, and that's supposed to be more of a conversation than something like we have here where it's chat based or that kind of thing. Then definitely latency can be a problem, and you're going to want to steer towards something that can give you a much more control or much lower latency. And then last but not least is your technical comfort level, because they do come, as you get more ability to tune things and tweak things in SRT, you really have to be prepared to do that. So you're going to want to get in there and get your hands dirty, then maybe SRT is a good choice. If you just want something a little more straightforward, then it could be that something like HLS or DASH is a better choice.
So a big one in there was definitely the latency question, of course. And, I think we hear from a lot of people all the time that are constantly saying they want zero latency, they want ultra low latency. At the end of the day, live streaming is a long way off from a zero latency scenario. There's always going to be some level of latency. And if you need minimal, then there's some choices you have to make. But the other thing to keep in mind is that even live television is not zero latency. So you got to keep that in mind as well. And when you compare some of these protocols to that, you actually quickly find out that some of these streaming protocols are superior even to the typical consumption of television broadcast. So as Dave was mentioning, HLS is typically the worst of the live streaming protocols because of the nature of the protocol. And again, it's mostly about delivering and consuming content, and that's okay. It doesn't matter. And by the nature of that protocol, which results in that higher latency, Also makes it really reliable. You don't have to deal with buffering as much and all these kind of annoyances with live streaming because you're getting those 10-second chunks as chunks. So it really helps. Dash is kind of in there. It can have a big range. And then historically, RTMP was anywhere from extremely low to 30 seconds-ish, depending. Sometimes that was a transcoding question or all kinds of different things. Other things like RTSP, which is, usually not an internet routable protocol. It could be, but most people usually don't use it that way. It's usually a local area network kind of thing, and IP cameras on a local network will use that extensively. And WebRTC, which people are going to be used to with browser-based conferencing tools and streaming tools, is under that 5-second range typically, and that's pretty good. But then SRT, it's configurable, which is a big thing, but under ideal conditions, you can get SRT down into the 80 millisecond kind of range, or intentionally push it to a second if you want. And you can fine tune that. And so in terms of the latency side of things, it's pretty significant difference in terms of what you're going to offer there. But coming back to that slide we had before, like when you're making these choices, which one is going to really fit your needs? Again, if you don't need that as minimal latency for interactivity or for whatever purpose, HLS and Dash are going to be very easy to set up, right? If you're used to doing RTMP, where you're basically just copying and pasting URLs and stream keys, and that's pretty much it, HLS and Dash are going to offer a very similar user experience in terms of simple, straightforward copy paste and you're done. SRT, big advantage of it being highly tunable, disadvantage that you actually have to know what you're doing, and there's a little more to it. When you get it and you have it running and it's working well, it's fantastic, and you can get so much more information about what's happening out of it as well, because of all that kind of two-way communication happening through the protocol. So again, there's not a lot to look at in terms of HLS or Dash. Like we said, you have your codec, whatever that might be, and you copy and paste a destination and you start it. SRT being different, we wanted to look at how you might configure that in a little more detail, since it's a bit more technical. Not in a bad way though. So this is an example of actually the settings page that you will see on a Pearl. When all of you, and there has been several questions, Dave, of people asking when they can get this update for Pearls, and we'll kind of dive into that a little later. But when you get your hands on this update, this is some of the settings page and information you would see with SRT. And this looks like there's a lot more information here. So maybe take us through some of the pieces.
Yeah, so I'll start with the bottom half of the screen first. That's the setup. So this is what you need to configure to get your SRT stream up and running. And the first choice you're offered is the connection mode. And there are 3 kind of connection modes that are kind of offered. You can choose to be a listener, or you can choose to be a caller, or you can choose rendezvous mode. And so basically the listener says you're not going to initiate the session, but you're going to listen and respond when someone tries to initiate a session with you. The caller mode is the opposite. So if someone's set up in a listener mode, then the other end of the connection needs to be set up as a caller. And that will be the one that tries to make connection and establish the first handshake and get the protocol started. It's independent of who is sending video in which direction. So you could have the source of the video be the caller, or the source of the video could be the listener. It doesn't matter. They're independent, but one needs to be a caller and one needs to be a listener. And the information that you require in order to get a listener or a caller set up is a little bit different. And that's why there's also the rendezvous mode, which allows that device to be either a listener or a caller. But for that, you need, if, for example, George and I have ours set up, the remote studio that we're going to, our Ottawa office, is set up in rendezvous mode, as is mine. And so they look for each other. They each try to initiate the protocol. And for that, I need to know the IP address of the device that's in our office, and it needs to know my IP address so it can try to initiate the call. So depending on what information you have about the network, depending on how often that information might change. For example, if you're moving your encoder onto different networks and that IP is changing all the time, then perhaps the rendezvous mode is not the most convenient, because you're going to end up having to change the other device that's listening for that all the time. So instead, if it was just set up as a listener and not needing to contact that, and the one that's moving would be the caller, that just makes the initial kind of setup a little simpler. But all that to say, once you choose that mode, you basically need an IP address and pick a port that these are going to communicate over. Once you've done that, you do have the option of encryption. So the standard AES style encryption, with it, you have a choice of a couple different key lengths and that kind of thing, and a passphrase. And then there's the latency setting, and that one is probably the most difficult, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But basically, you're setting up the latency as a trade-off for your round trip time. So think of it like a ping to your destination and back, as well as to so you take that round trip time, and you also have to consider packet loss. So if you've got a lossy network, you need to allow a little bit more latency for retransmission. And as I said, we've got a formula for that. We'll walk through it. It sounds complicated, but it's actually not too bad. And those are really the main settings that you need. So you need a URL. You pick, say, rendezvous mode or caller mode, listener mode, set your AES passphrase, and you're pretty much set up. From that point, the protocol is going to negotiate with the other end and get a connection up and running.
At first, these different modes seem confusing, but when you really kind of think about it for a moment, it's like making a phone call, right? You can either be the person answering or you can be the person initiating. And so once you kind of start to look at it that way, it starts to become very logical, and that can really help. If you've ever picked up the phone to call your friend and they were already there, that's, in a way that's kind of like rendezvous, I don't think that happens too much with cell phones, but it used to happen with landlines pretty frequently. And it was always weird when it happened, but convenient. So there's a number of different ways that can be beneficial. And the main thing is that it's, again, even the terminology they use with caller and listener is pretty logical when you just kind of sit down and think about it for a moment. But it's so different from the way we traditionally think of publishing, like with RTMP, that you gotta have to think about it a bit differently.
That's right. Yep. And the top section of the slide shows some of the statistics that you get, and this is one of the benefits of SRT, is it is sending those statistics both ways. So both ends, whether I was logged into the Pearl in this studio or whether I'm logged into mine here, we each can see these same statistics that will tell me, what I'm transmitting at in terms of megabits, what my round trip time is, what my packet loss is, all of these statistics. And that helps me to figure out what latency I want to put in that settings area. And so basically what you're doing is you're looking at the performance of your network, or the link that you have between the two devices, and then you're making a choice about how low a latency can operate well under those conditions. So the worse that network is, the higher your packet loss or the higher your round trip time, the more difficult it is going to be to have a connection with very low latency. So it allows you to still operate over that very unpredictable, lossy network, but you trade off some latency in order to achieve that. Conversely, if your network's very, very good, you can reduce your latency to the point where it's behaving very, 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 very low. As you mentioned, 80 milliseconds, and these kind of numbers are not unusual. So it gives you that capability to make that choice and to observe your network, test it out, and then say, all right, I'm going to tweak this and I'm going to get the latency where I want it, or at least the best I can get it over the connection that I have to deal
absolutely. With. And while we were prepping to go live, Dave and I were playing a little bit of a competition on what our stats were, because we can know that, right? So I pulled mine up just now, And I'm looking at a round trip time of about 14, 15 milliseconds and a packet loss of somewhere in the zero point 0.6, zero point 0.7 range, which is pretty good. I mean, I don't have a huge amount of upload where I am, but it's pretty good time, which is nice. So although I have mine set to 200 millisecond latency, so do you, Dave, but that's partially because we're two people, so we kind of need to match. Otherwise, everything would be off. Right. But again, that gives you the advantage of if you are having multiple parties being brought together, you can choose to make sure they all match. Usually that's going to be the lowest common denominator. Whoever's at the worst, everyone's going to have to match them. That's fine. But you have the option. Whereas if you were using something else and you were just pulling in multiple RTMP feeds, you'd have no way of being able to control any of it, and resyncing it would be a nightmare. And so this is a big piece. The other part that was in there is a section that you usually don't have to play with much, but there is also what they label as recovery bandwidth overhead, essentially reserving a chunk of overhead to help with, like I was mentioning earlier, those peaks and valleys. Those are things that other protocols have never really done. If you try to run it to 100% of your upload and then your upload dips, too bad. Making sure you're reserving overhead can really help to make sure you're not running into other network collisions and things like that. So there's a lot of advanced tools there. So as we said, more complex to set up, absolutely. And there's a whole way to tune it on this chart. But having the option of doing that is power in your hands, and power is a big deal.
Yep. And so I'll walk through this table really briefly. There's really just two settings that we're trying to get out of here. And the first one is called a round trip time multiplier. And so the idea here is you want to set your latency to accommodate for two elements. One, your round trip time, and your packet loss. And the way that they combine those two together is to say, depending on kind of what threshold your packet loss has crossed, you're going to have a different multiplier for your round trip time. So for example, here we've shown a chart with assuming a 20 millisecond round trip time. And then we've said if our packet loss on the far left there is less than 1%, then our round trip time multiplier is 3. And that would give us a 60 millisecond latency. So we could enter 60 milliseconds in that box and say that's the latency I want on this link, provided my round trip time is 20 or less and my packet loss is 1% or less. If either of those two things are not true, then I have to look elsewhere on the table. So as we go down in the rows, that's our packet loss percentage increasing. So if I go up to say 7% or near 7% packet loss, instead of multiplying my round trip time by 3, I should multiply it by about 5. And so then a more appropriate setting would be 100 milliseconds instead of the 60 milliseconds. So you really are able to just quickly determine, based on the stats that SRT is providing to you, it tells you what the packet loss is. You can look at the multiplier that you should be using and then just take your round trip time, multiply it, and maybe add a little margin for safety. And that gives you a very good idea of what kind of latency can be achieved over the link that's performing at those kind of numbers. So it sounds a little complicated, but once you've done it a couple of times, it's actually quite straightforward.
Yeah, and I think that's the main thing here is these aren't hard and fast rules. And if you want to add extra latency just for safety, like we've actually done, there's nothing wrong with that either, because realistically, even at 200 milliseconds like we have set, that's still pretty superior to any other protocol. So, and that's not a perfect scenario for SRT by any means, but it's still vastly superior to any other protocol. So it's a win all around at that point.
Yeah, I'm looking at my live numbers right now on my SRT connection. I'm at a 0.7% packet loss, so less than 1. It means my round trip multiplier, according to this table, should be 3. And my round trip time is about 25 milliseconds. So I should be safe at about 75 milliseconds is what I should be able to achieve over this link pretty comfortably. As you mentioned, George, we wanted to be pretty conservative. We set it at 200 and just said, in our case, we're not that latency sensitive. Whether it's 100 or 200 or 75 is not going to make any difference to our end viewers. So we have the ability to say, let's trade a little bit of latency just to give it a little bit more retransmission buffer and a little better capability to deal with if that packet loss were to all of a sudden creep up a little bit or my round trip time were to grow, I would be covered. So we got lots of margin in there to make sure that the SRT signal is good and solid.
Yeah, exactly.
So here we're just trying to, again, illustrate that concept of find your round trip time, find the multiplier from your percentage loss, just multiply those two together, and that's the latency you pop in that box when you're configuring the device. So it looked like a lot of charts and numbers and things, but really it is that simple. You look up one thing, you look up a second thing, you multiply them together, and you get your latency answer. At least that's the minimum latency you should be putting in that box. And then, of course, you're free to add some margin on top of that. Now maybe we can walk through Pearl support. So as we mentioned, we've added all three of these protocols to our Pearl family. And when I say added, meaning it's not out yet, but it's coming very, very soon, and we'll get to that. But certainly we're using it live here today. We've had some beta customers trialing our stuff, and those tests are going very well. A few weeks back, maybe a month or two now, the SRT Alliance hosted a plug fest where we were able to connect to all kinds of different SRT gear, and we've been doing a lot of that as well. So that gave us a really good opportunity to connect to many of those logos that you saw in that one slide of the SRT Alliance. So there were different PTZ cameras, software encoders, CDNs. So we were able, even products like ours that weren't yet kind of fully released to the market, they were all there testing with each other to make sure that the protocol was going to be well interoperable, and it really was. It was a really good event to show us kind of how mature that protocol is and how easy it is to interop across multiple devices. So that was really great.
And that's the great thing about the Alliance, right? Is that you have this group of oftentimes competitors, but they've agreed that in this they want to talk and they want to experiment and they want to try things out and they want to use this as a wide-ranging interop, and that's been really cool to take part in. So those of you who are not familiar with the Pearl, clearly based on chat and some of the questions, we have quite a few existing Pearl customers on today's webinar, which is awesome. Really thank you so much for being a customer. But for those of you who are not familiar, the Pearl that we've referred to many times throughout today's presentation comes in kind of two models, the Pearl 2 and the Pearl Mini, and they are all-in-one standalone hardware video production systems, essentially. So where you might have traditionally had a rack full of switchers and recorders and stream encoders and splitters and scalers all kind of doing their different pieces, the idea with a Pearl is take all of those and compress it down into a single dedicated piece of hardware. As part of that, trying to make sure it's extremely versatile, reliable, big thing for us, easy to use, but also not diminishing any of the professional quality of inputs supported and various other pieces. That's kind of the idea with the Pearls, and they've been doing that for years, and now being able to add things like SRT, especially for me, is kind of adding to that toolbox in a big way in terms of the professional quality of things, the reliability and the versatility of what Pearl's going to be able to offer. So as we've been saying, these three protocols are going to be added in the firmware update 4.12. That is coming very soon. There was a couple of things we just had to, iron out, a few little wrinkles in the fabric before we put it into your hands. We don't like putting things out that we aren't 100% confident is ready. So we know everyone's anxious to get it, and we appreciate that. So we just want to make sure that it's ready to go. Of course, the Pearl systems currently support all the protocols like RTMP and RTMPS. Those aren't going anywhere. And in the case of Pearl 2, it also supports NDI. One person in chat has been asking about NDI for Pearl Mini. We could go into a long-winded explanation about that, but there's a number of reasons for that. if we could do it and it would work well, we would have. That's basically the quick summary. So there's a number of factors that result in it just not behaving the way we would want it to deliver to customers, and so it's not there. I don't think I could put it any more basic than that, unfortunately. So we appreciate that everyone is interested in that, and if something were to change where we could do it, there's no reason we wouldn't. So.
Right.
So maybe someday, we'll see.
Yep.
So again, there's a lot here now with these 3 new protocols on top of what was already there. And in the context of where we find ourselves today, in all of this pandemic stuff of the past few months, and honestly, what we've really seen within the world of live streaming and content production is a huge leap into remote production. And this is something that may have otherwise taken years to get to where things have become in the past few months, just due to the pandemic forcing everyone to rethink their workflows of not being able to be in the same place anymore, people having to work from home, which is a silver lining to all of this really unfortunate situation, is that if this is your world, we are now leaps ahead of where we were 6 months ago, kind of by force. So, and I think, SRT really can be a fantastic piece going forward into this as well, because although our producer is not controlling my Pearl or Dave's Pearl today, he could be. He is controlling the Pearl 2 that's in our studio remotely from his home, but he could be controlling all of these endpoints at the same time and doing the full content production. And David, I would basically just have to show up, sit down, and that's it. That is a reality now when we start to look at what SRT can bring to the table.
Yeah, and that's a really important element, because we did talk about, trying to decide which protocol is best for you. Part of it is, well, how technical do you want to get? How much do you want to look under the hood and really start tweaking things? And for someone who may be out at a contribution site, the answer might be very little. Yet with the Pearl technology, it can be the producer that's setting all of those things. So it really, being able to remotely log in and control that encoder from anywhere means that it isn't the kind of field talent or whoever at the remote site that's got to configure all this SRT stuff. That can easily be done by one technical person who's in charge of both ends of the network connection. The statistics are transmitted from one end to the other, so it doesn't matter which end you're looking at. You can see how everything's performing. So it is really well set up to allow kind of a remote operation and a remote configuration, which is great, because without that, then you're back to trying to walk someone through a setup and explain to them what the settings are for and how to use them. In this case, you can just have your expert log in and take over and get everything set up.
Exactly. And for those of you not aware, through one of our services called AV Studio, you can remotely log into Pearls through the cloud and control them remotely, which, at an administrative level, which, from that perspective, you could ship someone a Pearl and just tell them to plug it into the network, log into it, and, do what you need to do from a remote perspective. So, mixing all these different pieces together just makes the toolbox deeper. So we're going to get to questions here, and there's a ton of stuff. I'm going to look at chat first, because people have had some great questions and comments, and then I'll look at the Q&A panel. So if anyone has any questions, please put them into the Q&A panel, but I'm going to look at chat first, because there was a few in there that I want to address. First of all, we did have a number of people, Ronald in the Netherlands was just saying hi to us, and he was also saying a message for Yusufa, Beta SRT, they're really impressed. So there's an example of a customer of ours who is currently using a beta test of SRT, and they're loving it. I see your correction there, Ronald, as well, and maybe Yusufa would take the massage instead of the message. I don't know. We'll see. But there's some other things in here as well that are pretty important to SRT. So one of them is there a way to send a return video feed to a Pearl via SRT? For example, the control room sending each of you the program in return. Yes, you can do that. You're starting to add some complexity, but one of the ways that Pearl's particularly good at that is the fact that Pearl can create multiple encoded outputs simultaneously and do whatever you need to do with them. So in this case, if our Pearl 2 in our studio wanted to send back an SRT feed to Dave and I, yeah, we could absolutely do that. Earlier, people were also asking about how we're doing this show, and someone speculated that we might be using a Zoom call as a back channel, and that is actually true. So again, we're not using the back feed with SRT, although we could. One of the downsides there is, as we were talking about earlier, we've set a 200 millisecond latency. And so with all that round trip time, Dave and I wouldn't be having a natural conversation purely through SRT. So we are using Zoom as a back channel for that. That being said, it is possible to do it. It's definitely easier if you're doing a handoff to a remote guest instead of a live conversation the way Dave and I have been. So if it was truly a remote presenter, let's say, then we probably wouldn't be using the Zoom back channel quite as much, although it definitely helps to have some sort of other back channel to queue people up and let them know what's going on. So for example, in our Zoom here in this graphic, which we put in here just as not really part of the presentation, but as a keep in our pocket in case we needed it. And yeah, sure enough, we anticipated that question well. Our producer, who is not Cameron today, but anyway, that's what the graphic says, and that's the wrong George. But we've done this several times now. So, but essentially, our producer's in that same Zoom call, so he can talk to us. Dave and I are monitoring that in our ears. If he has something to yell at us, like when Dave's internet went down, he can do that, and you guys can't hear it. Dave and I can talk to each other very naturally, even though all of our audio is actually getting to the stream through SRT. So because our latencies are so similar, the result that you guys see is perfectly fine. So there's a lot of ways of doing this, but yes, this is essentially the way that we're doing it. So it's pretty cool. So I'm going to go through some questions here. First one, the most upvoted one, and this is probably a really good one that Christopher was asking. When do you expect these new protocols to be adopted by platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, etc.? What do you think about that one, Dave?
Well, I don't have specific dates, but we know they will be soon. So we can't share dates either that we A, don't know, or B, haven't been publicized by those platforms. But it's definitely coming. We've already seen some platforms like Akamai and a couple others have already said RTMP is over. We're moving beyond it. And so if you have an encoder set up, you need to move beyond RTMP. We expect many more will follow. And we're definitely seeing, as we have conversations, this year a little less because we haven't been at the traditional trade shows, the NAB and the Infocom, but typically we would be visiting a lot of different industry guys. Now we're having more Zoom calls and arranged meetings. But in the conversations we have had, it's obvious people are moving that way, as we did, right? So this was something that we were only contemplating 6 months ago. We knew it was going to come. We didn't know when. And then about 4 months ago, we made the decision, yep, it's top of our list. Let's get it done now. And that's because we do anticipate many of these platforms being able to support this very soon. So we wanted to be, not too late to the market with our update. But we don't think people will be waiting too long before, the YouTube and Facebooks and others will be having these protocols as their preferred choice.
Absolutely. Well. And, we mentioned earlier, and Ronald's putting in chat as well, Wowza is already using SRT as an option. We mentioned that, Akamai has gone away from RTMP, and they've primarily been focusing on HLS and DASH at this point, but I'm sure, they'll look at SRT as well. In terms of, Christopher's mentioning specifically some social media platforms, which are obviously extremely popular for live streaming. I think based on, again, I don't have specific information on that. I don't know any secrets that anyone else doesn't. It's speculation, but I suspect that the social media platforms will primarily be looking at HLS or DASH. just based on the way their workflow is. The more enterprise level things like a Wowza, like some of our partners at Streamshark, things like that, they're more likely to be looking at the SRT stuff. So there definitely will be some differences depending on what kind of customer are you for that CDN as to which one you might end up dealing with. And I'm quite certain that the social platforms are already experimenting with all of them. Just which one they choose ultimately, we'll see.
Good question.
Yeah, so the other one here was Ryan was asking, when will this update be available for Pearl 2? So where are we at? I know we had a meeting just yesterday talking about this.
Yep, so target is to get it out before the end of the month, which is not long. So within the next week, you'll see it coming out from us. So we're really in the very last stages of verification, kind of tidying everything up and getting ready just to push it out as a officially supported release. As we mentioned, Ronald mentioned he's been testing with the beta load. We have a number of customers that did offer that, and we took them up on it. So we've had some good testing in the field. That all went extremely well. The plug fest that I talked about went really well. So now we're really just tidying up the last couple things, and it'll be out very, very shortly.
I wanted to revisit, and although I answered it earlier, just in case people have been coming and going, just wanted to reiterate, someone was asking whether we were publishing to Crowdcast with RTMP or with WebRTC. We're using RTMP. One of the cool things of Crowdcast as a platform is you have those options, which is nice. But we use RTMP from the Pearls to publish to Crowdcast. So just to reiterate that. Christopher also commented earlier, the image quality on this webinar is fantastic. What gear are you using to accomplish this hi-fi webcast? Well, now that cat's out of the bag. You asked that much earlier, Christopher, and so I didn't want to give you a sneak peek. But now you know. We're using Pearl Minis with SRT, feeding a Pearl 2 in a central location, and then back out. The reason why it's such high quality is using the Pearls and SRT. Some of our past webinars, and if you guys have been repeat viewers, you know, about a month ago, those webinars, up until actually the past couple weeks, were all done using Zoom and cropping and a bunch of other creative stuff, which is still a totally viable way to do things, but it's not the highest quality way to do things. The audio won't be as good and the video won't be as good. Doing it this way with SRT means we can control the audio better, we can control the video better, we can make the most of the bandwidth we have available, and the power's in our hands. We're not relying on something like Zoom or Teams or Google Meet or whatever conferencing platforms which overcompress everything all to hell, and just the quality is not that great. So this looks so good because of SRT, simply put, and the fact that we're using, you know, hardware encoders that we can set them to do whatever we want within the limits of our bandwidth. Let's see. Elizabeth was asking how. Some people are voting and changing my order of questions. So let's see. Elizabeth was asking here, I'm going to go back down to that one, how difficult would it be to change protocols if, for example, you choose to stream in HLS and then want to stream in SRT? Well, of course, the Pearls can do both. And because Pearls can actually create multiple stream publishers at the same time, you could actually have an encoding channel on a Pearl that has an RTMP, an HLS, a dash, and an SRT stream all configured, kind of ready to go, and you just start the ones you need. Or maybe you have enough bandwidth to do all of them at the same time if you really wanted to. You could do that. So how hard is it to switch between them? I mean, again, it depends on your workflow, but if one day you need HLS and the next day you need SRT and you want them pre-configured, they can, on a Pearl, exist at the same time. So that, another big advantage of the Pearl is you don't really have to change anything. You could set it up and just start and stop the ones you need at any given time. Okay, back up at the top of the list because this one was an upvoted one. So Ronnie was asking, we recently had 8 remote guests, 4 dance teams, 3 judges, and 1 DJ coming into a vMix call over WebRTC using only phones/computers in the remote end. How would using SRT improve in this case, And is it possible to do this without any SRT hardware on the remote side? We ingested the DJ and sent his audio and the dances out to the judges, and obviously had huge sync issues. What would be required to do that? So Ronnie, ultimately that, and I had a conversation with a customer just yesterday. That's essentially the final frontier of all of this, right? Like you're asking a question that everyone is facing right now. It's a big one, and it's a challenging one, because none of the tools really as they exist today were actually designed to fix that at the moment. So everyone's trying to bridge different pieces together to make it happen. You went with what is honestly the most common choice, and ran into the most common problem. In my opinion, I think SRT can solve that, but can it be solved without some form of hardware on a remote end? Kind of. There's a lot of software that does SRT as well. There's apps on phones that can do SRT. There's obviously your common streaming software like OBS and a few others that can do SRT. But ultimately, there's still some hardware doing it. And how good that hardware is ultimately, is going to play a big factor in that. From our perspective, slightly biased one, I suppose, but we would definitely suggest putting hardware like Pearls at each of those points, because you can be assured that it's reliable, and you don't have to have, maybe one person has a weaker computer than another person, and that screws up the whole chain. You're only as strong as your weakest link at the end of the day, right? So using common hardware at every point is going to be a big advantage. And from our perspective, that's going to be Pearls. But that's a tough one to give you a clear answer on, because like I say, that's ultimately the biggest hurdle everyone's trying to jump right now, is how to do exactly that in the best way possible. If we go back to that graphic of how we're running this show, Dave, you're kind of looking at the same thing. You're kind of looking at some level of back channel. In our case, we're using Zoom, but it could be anything. It could be literally a phone call if you want, just so that people are on the same page on a basic communication level, but then using something like SRT to feed each endpoint into a single place, like you were doing with WebRTC, and then streaming it out from there. You're looking at something pretty similar, ultimately, I think. So I hope that helped, Ronnie. Brian also asked, what is the latency in input to output on a Pearl 2? Maybe, Dave, if you want to tackle that one.
Is that in the context of these specific protocols?
He didn't specify. He didn't specify, so yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I would say, again, it depends a little bit what you're doing with that data. So if you're just bringing, let's say, a camera image in or a computer image in, and then you're going out, say, the HDMI output, the latency's in about the 100 millisecond range. If you're encoding, then maybe it's up to 150. If you're combining multiple pieces of video together and doing overlays and titling and that kind of stuff, it can get up to about 300 milliseconds before it launches from Pearl. In the context of these protocols, it's going to depend on your network. It's going to depend on the decoding side. So there's a lot of other variables in terms of end-to-end, kind of what they call glass-to-glass delay. Is a little harder for us to specify. But your question was from the input of Pearl to the output
essentially
of Pearl.
The inbox
somewhere
latency, essentially.
Yeah, so it's somewhere between 100 milliseconds and 350 kind of range, depending on what processing needs to get done to that video and audio on the way out.
Exactly.
So those are typical numbers for Pearl.
Yeah, so Ronnie had another follow-up question here about the return feeds, and I think we answered that already, so I'll dismiss that one. Here's another question here that OnPoint Presentation Services was asking. They've asked a lot of good questions today, so I really appreciate that. Is a static IP or dynamic DNS required to access the Pearl, or do you have a backend? So if you're trying to do it remotely, there's several ways of doing it. The way we usually do it is with our own service that we call AV Studio. For that, you don't need static IPs and you don't need dynamic DNS. It's essentially a cloud-based system that you pair your Pearl to, and because they're both our products, AV Studio can create a secure tunnel directly to the Pearl backend, so that you can access it. So you don't need those. That being said, if you don't want to use AV Studio and you wanted to maybe do it slightly less secure with, port forwarding and those kind of things, then you absolutely can. And in that case, you might want a static IP, or you might want a dynamic DNS, or put it in a DMZ or something like that. I don't recommend that method, but you absolutely can if you want. The other way most people usually go about it is with VPNs. VPN from your site to the other site, and then you're treated like you're on the local network to access Pearl. That or AV Studio. VPN or AV Studio would be your secure methods to do it. Other ways is a bit dicey with port forwarding, and I wouldn't recommend that in most cases. Kevin is asking here, is there a possibility to send SRT to multiple parties? And if so, what scalability do you expect it to have? Is it a simple linear multiplier based on bandwidth, or does it take a lot of CPU?
I'll grab that question. So I'll answer the last bit first. Does it take a lot of CPU? The answer is no. So as George mentioned, once you've encoded the data, so let's say you create a channel, you bring a couple images in, you composite them, you do whatever you want to do. You're sending that image out over SRT. Adding a second SRT publisher to a different destination doesn't take a lot of CPU in the Pearl context. So adding multiple of those is not really an issue. You can certainly send to multiple SRT endpoints from Pearl, from a single channel, from multiple channels. That's not a problem. But yes, your bandwidth does scale exactly linearly when you do that. So if I've got a 5 megabit stream that I'm sending over SRT to my main destination, and then I decide I want a redundant ingest point where I'm also sending SRT, that's going to add another 5 megabits. So now I need the uplink bandwidth that can essentially handle both of those connections comfortably. So that is one way to do it, is to just have Pearl replicate kind of those SRT connections, and they are individual point-to-point connections to each of those SRT endpoints. So you'll need to have the bandwidth that can handle kind of the linear increase in transmission bandwidth. The second way to do it is there are services like Haivision's SRT hub, which allows you to send one single SRT link to the hub, and then you can replicate it from there. And they've got a way of dynamically spinning up resources depending on how many you need to replicate and all that kind of thing. So that's a way that allows you to do it so that you're not increasing the burden on your uplink. You're using that transmission of 5 megabits once to get to the hub, and then from the hub you can fan out to multiple destinations. It does leave you, it does mean you have one kind of lack of redundancy to the hub, but again, if you have double the bandwidth, you could certainly send redundant links to the hub, and then from the hub you could fan out to however many you like, 10, 20, 50, right, whatever. So there's a couple ways to do it, and it really depends on what your bandwidth is from your venue or your place of contribution where you're doing that contribution encoding, how much bandwidth you have to play with to get to those destinations.
Yeah. So it's a little more complexity, but basically, part of your question there, Kevin, was it a simple multiplier, linear multiplier based on bandwidth? For the most part, yes, unless you're using something else cloud-based to redistribute it.
Like a restreaming service or a hub service.
Yeah. SRT isn't really designed as a multicast protocol, so it's...
No, it's not, but that's where the SRT kind of hub comes into play. And we would see, similarly, the way we have with, restreaming services where you could send them today, typically it's RTMP, but you send them something and then they'll fan out RTMP to Facebook, YouTube, wherever you want to go. Once they're supporting SRT, then you have the same kind of infrastructure where you go SRT into them once and they can fan it out to multiple, and then it's not your own bandwidth that's increasing. you're already getting to a cloud service, and then from there you're spinning up instances that can fan that
And again,
out.
that being said, you can go really into the weeds with this depending on what your workflow is. I mean, let's say it's a two office scenario and you have a point-to-point SRT link between them, and everyone in office B needs to see that, but they're all on the same network. You could actually feed a Pearl to a Pearl in the two different offices, and the receiving Pearl, if you will, could then stream it on your local network using multicast or something like that. So there's, again, depending on your workflow, there's a lot of different ways you could accomplish it. Again, it depends on your needs and what the workflow is. Kevin also asked, have we considered WebRTC contribution or joining WebRTC meetings from a Pearl? Not recently, but it has been discussed occasionally.
It's definitely on our list. We've had people ask, could I just have browser-based contribution? It is something we've looked at. It's not something that we're working on at the moment. It does remain on our list, but there's a number of things on our list at the moment. So it is something we've heard of. It's not something we can promise in any specific time frame, but it's definitely on our list of wishes.
Here's another one to pull out that other slide that we had in our back pocket. On Point Presentation asking another good question. Is Pearl Mini capable of receiving one SRT and transmit two SRT? Short answer, yes. This is our chart of essentially what the Pearl Mini and Pearl 2 can support in SRT. Both can be an encoder, both can be a decoder. Both offer three different options for the AES encryption, 128.192.256. Both support all three modes, caller, listener, and rendezvous. Where they really start to differ, and this just boils down to system performance, is the number of inputs and outputs. So in our testing, we have found that Pearl Mini bringing an SRT input, one of them is fine, and doing as many as 3 SRT outputs. Pearl 2, Pearl 2 is just bigger, a lot more power going on there. So just like some of the other things it can do, 6 and 6. So if you're looking for the bigger hub, it's obviously the Pearl 2 here. But to your scenario, 1 in and 2 out, Mini can definitely do that. So I just give you guys that idea. Michael is asking here, can SRT be made simpler through some sort of third-party management where it gets to the point of just being a server key and stream key, or in the case of the Pearls, something through the remote interface? I don't think SRT is ever going to be boiled down to something as simple as, stream server URL and stream key like RTMP, HLS, and DASH. And again, if that's what you need from a simplicity standpoint, you probably want to stick with one of those protocols. So, once you understand it and you have a good setup, it is actually pretty simple. But there's always going to be things to consider and look at with the latency and all those other different things. That's just a function of the protocol and is something that you can't ignore. Otherwise, you might find yourself in trouble. Or maybe you just don't care about latency and you just set the latency to always be crazy high. That's up to you. But it's never going to be as simple as some of those other options, I don't think. Although once you get your head around it, it's actually really not bad. Not bad at all. Yep. Let's see. Michael also asked, let's see, that's actually the same question. So I'm going to delete that one. There was a couple of those. All right. Let's see. Yeah, so we did have a couple of polls. So if you still want to weigh in on some of those polls, one of them was asking, does Pearl seem to meet your needs for streaming solution? Feel free to weigh in on that. And the last poll we wanted to throw up there was, did you find this webinar helpful? Was it detailed enough? Or were you looking for something else? So weigh in on that. And we do have a couple of last minute questions here popping up, so I'm going to get into those. Again, on point asking, with SRT to a CDN, can we expect the time to viewer to also be reduced considering the RTMP latency is out of the picture? Yeah, I think that's probably realistic depending on what the CDN might be doing for transcoding. CDN latency, a big part of it is transcoding. So it's one of the reasons we mentioned much earlier in the beginning is that things like HLS and Dash as ingestion, also as delivery, one of the reasons it's easier and cheaper for CDNs is they may not need to do as much transcoding. They can just have a straight throughput, and that would ultimately help reduce latency as well. But with SRT, you probably will have some level of transcoding. So potentially yes, but how much varies, I suppose. Let's see. Ronnie was also asking, can it be set up to go live when it gets power? Yes, when you power down a Pearl and then power it back up, it will always resume its last state. So if your SRT publisher was running, or your RTMP publisher was running, or whatever you're using is running, your recording is running, when you power Pearl back up, those same instances will be in the last state they were left. So if they're running, they'll be running. Let's see. I'll answer this one because it's a super quick one, and I know you love this question, Dave, but OnPoint was also asking if Pearl supports Dante audio.
That's easy. No, it doesn't. Again, it's on our wish list. We got a number of users. Obviously, that's become a super popular protocol. I can understand why. Having the network capability that Dante offers is fantastic, especially when you're in an environment with lots of channels of audio. So I'll have to say perhaps someday, but not at the moment. So it's another one of those ones that's on our list of things we'd love to add to Pearl. But I can't give you a specific time frame because it's not something we're working on right at the moment.
Yeah. And then the last question here, and then we will call it, unless you guys have some other last minute emergency question. But the last question here also comes from OnPoint, sending, consider the scenario of a control room and a remote unit with a Pearl in each spot, and the control room with a static IP. Would the remote unit be a caller to the control room, considering that it may be behind a firewall, and this would help navigate out from behind the firewall? So in a lot of ways, that's actually the same setup that we're doing right now. And both Dave and I are using Rendezvous, and then that's being brought into the Pearl 2 in our control room. And it's traversing firewalls on all 3 points with no special setup. I did not change anything on my firewall settings. Dave didn't touch his, and we didn't really change anything in the office either. It's one of the big advantages of SRT is that it traverses firewalls very, very well. So, that's you wouldn't necessarily have to, but the caller feature would work fine for sure. Listener, if you wanted to pull it instead, also could work fine. I mean, any of them would work. We happen to be using Rendezvous in this case, yeah, I mean, any of them would really work for that scenario. Depending, I think that the question you actually have to ask there is, who is your remote operator at the far side, or if you have one at all. If you don't, and you're remotely controlling that through AV Studio or something like that, then it probably doesn't matter. If you're trying to make it as basic as possible, then you might use caller or listener. Rendezvous you need to know your own IP a little more to tell people what it is and that kind of thing. So there's a couple other pieces there, but I hope that answers that on point. And then the last one here, Michael revisiting this, any chance of building in a WebRTC feature request for quick and dirty remote guests? And again, we kind of answered that. It's something we've thought about. And as I kind of mentioned in a general term, all of this pandemic lockdown stuff has really made people rethink all of the different priorities and uses and workflows and things like that. So, is there a chance? Well, there's always a chance. Is it an immediate future thing? Probably not, but who knows? As things change, as market changes and demands change, it's one of the things here at Epiphan that we take particular pride in is we always want to listen to our customers, what their needs are, what their experiences are, and try to improve our products to fit their needs. So, a ton of you have brought that up on today's webinar. We're listening, and if that's something that makes sense, to adjust our priorities, then we may do that. But yeah, that's something we always look at. And again, in the context of this reality, normally we would be listening to exactly that kind of feedback at trade show booths. You know, last week would have been Infocom. We would have been listening to that stuff in person. We didn't get to this year, and it looks like 2020 is just not going to happen for trade shows. Maybe 2021 we'll be back to having these conversations in person with you. In the meantime, we've been doing a ton of these webinars. Every week we have a new webinar, sometimes two, with a lot of different content. And so please check out epiphan.com/webinars. Look at the future scheduled ones, even look at the back catalog. We post all of these as VOD after the fact. So even the ones all the way back in March, if there's something there that's interesting, check it out. We also always do our weekly live show, live at Epiphan, every Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, which is tomorrow at basically this time. And we touch on a lot of topics. They are shorter. Our webinars often run an hour, hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. The live show is much shorter, condensed format for a lot of topics. And tomorrow, I think we have a pretty interesting one that might touch on some of the questions today about live, guests and remote production stuff. So tune in for that. That's live streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch simultaneously every Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern. And then, of course, like I said, the webinars, we got a ton more coming up. So definitely check those out. Follow, subscribe, like all those things and the social stuff, and keep up to date with all the things we're doing. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. So really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. I really, really do appreciate it. So come back for the next ones. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dave. This was great. And thanks to our producer today. We put his feet to the fire. Did great. So thanks, producer.
Great job, Adam.